When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, more than 100 U-boats were still at sea. In the days that followed, they surfaced in quiet harbours across Europe, their war finally over. What came next was unprecedented. Hundreds of submarines captured, studied, and deliberately destroyed. This is what happened to the U-boats after World War II. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. Within hours, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's successor and former U-boat commander, issued a simple but historic order. All U-boats are to cease operations, surface, and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. The long war beneath the Atlantic was over. For Dönitz, this moment carried profound personal significance. He had built the U-boat arm from fewer than 60 submarines in 1939 to over 1,000 by war's end. Now, as Germany's final Führer, he was ordering their surrender. The irony was not lost on him. In his final radio address to the U-boat fleet, his voice reportedly cracked with emotion as he spoke of their sacrifices and urged them to accept defeat with dignity. Across the North Atlantic, the Bay of Biscay and the fjords of Norway, more than 150 U-boats surfaced, their exhausted crews hoisting white flags as Allied aircraft circled overhead. For many of these submariners, the decision to surrender was agonizing. Some commanders initially refused to believe the transmission was genuine, suspecting an elaborate Allied ruse. Others considered scuttling their boats rather than handing them over to the enemy. In the end, however, most complied. They sailed toward ports such as Loch Erebol in Scotland, Leazahally in Northern Ireland, and Portland in southern England, each arrival marking the quiet collapse of the Wolfpack fleet that once haunted Allied shipping lanes. The scenes at these ports were extraordinary. At Loch Erebol, a remote inlet in the Scottish Highlands that locals called Loch Oiriabhol, nearly 40 U-boats anchored together in what became known as the Bay of Sorrow. The sight of so many enemy submarines gathered in one place was unprecedented. British sailors who witnessed the arrivals described a mixture of triumph and unease. These vessels had terrorized Atlantic convoys for 6 years, sending thousands of merchant ships to the bottom. Now they sat silent and defeated, their conning towers emblazoned with fading emblems and kill markings. The surrender process was tightly controlled. Allied warships escorted the submarines into port, where Royal Navy and United States Navy boarding parties seized codes, charts, and weapons. Engineers catalogued the rusted, battle-scarred vessels, many barely seaworthy after months underwater. Some U-boats arrived with engines smoking, hulls damaged by depth charges, and crews so malnourished they could barely stand. Others appeared in better condition, their commanders having maintained discipline to the bitter end. Each submarine told its own story through the wear and tear visible on its steel hide. Among the first to surrender was U-249, which surfaced off the coast of Norway on the 9th of May. Its commander, Oberleutnant Zur See Uwe Fischer, had been at sea when the surrender order came through. Rather than risk internment in a Soviet-controlled port, he sailed west toward British waters. When Royal Navy destroyers intercepted his boat, Fisher formally surrendered his vessel and crew, handing over his service pistol and the boat's war diary. The diary would later provide Allied intelligence with valuable insights into U-boat operations during the final months of the war. U-977 chose a different path. Under the command of Oberleutnant Heinz Schaefer, this Type 7C submarine was patrolling near Norway when Germany capitulated. Schaefer, unwilling to surrender to what he feared would be harsh Soviet treatment, made a controversial decision. He addressed his crew, offering them a choice. Those who wished to surrender could disembark in Norway, while those willing to risk a desperate voyage would continue with him to Argentina. 16 men chose to leave. The remaining 32 embarked on an incredible 66-day journey across the Atlantic, traveling submerged by day and surfacing only at night to recharge batteries. They arrived in Mar del Plata, Argentina, on the 17th of August 1945, 3 months after the war's end. The Argentine authorities interned the crew, and U-977 was eventually handed over to the United States Navy. Schaefer's journey sparked wild speculation about escaped Nazi officials and hidden treasures, though later investigations found no evidence of such cargo. The submarine had simply carried desperate men seeking to avoid captivity. Not all U-boats complied with the surrender order. U-234, a massive Type XB mine-laying submarine converted for transport, was en route to Japan when news of the capitulation reached it on the 10th of May. The boat carried an extraordinary cargo: uranium oxide, mercury, optical glass, and 2 Japanese naval officers who served as liaisons with Germany's Asian ally. Upon hearing of Germany's defeat, the Japanese officers committed ritual suicide rather than face capture. The submarine's commander, Captain Lieutenant Johann Heinrich Fehler, then made the decision to surrender to American forces rather than continuing to Japan or returning to Europe. U-234 surfaced off the coast of Newfoundland on the 14th of May and was escorted to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire. Its cargo created immediate interest among Allied intelligence officers, particularly the uranium oxide, which some historians have speculated was intended for Japan's own atomic research program. The submarine itself underwent extensive technical evaluation before being deliberately sunk during weapons testing in November 1947. The logistics of managing so many captured vessels were immense. At Lisahally, near Londonderry in Northern Ireland, the Royal Navy established one of the primary collection points. Here, German crews were disembarked and sent to prisoner of war camps, while British engineers began the painstaking process of making the submarines safe. Many boats arrived with armed torpedoes still in their tubes and mines in their holds. Explosive ordnance disposal teams worked around the clock to remove these weapons, often in cramped conditions and with machinery whose operation they barely understood. It was dangerous work. Several sailors were injured when corroded mechanisms gave way unexpectedly, and at least one near disaster occurred when a torpedo's arming mechanism activated spontaneously during removal. In the following weeks, Allied leaders faced a pressing question: what to do with the world's most advanced submarine fleet? The practical concerns were significant. Each submarine required constant maintenance to prevent it from sinking at its moorings. Pumps had to run continuously to manage leaks. Guards were needed to prevent sabotage or scavenging. The cost of maintaining the entire fleet, even temporarily, was staggering. Yet the captured vessels represented an intelligence windfall that none of the Allied powers wanted to squander. The United States and Britain saw immense value in the revolutionary Type 23 and Type 43 designs. These submarines, introduced in the war's final year, represented a quantum leap in submarine technology. Unlike their predecessors, which were essentially surface ships that could dive temporarily, the Type 23 boats were designed to operate primarily underwater. Their streamlined hulls, enhanced battery capacity, and sophisticated snorkel systems allowed them to remain submerged for extended periods without surfacing. They could achieve underwater speeds of 17 knots in short bursts, fast enough to outrun many Allied escort vessels. Had these boats entered service earlier and in greater numbers, they might have dramatically altered the Battle of the Atlantic's outcome. The Soviet Union, entering the early Cold War with an appetite for military technology, demanded its share of the captured fleet. Joseph Stalin personally took interest in acquiring German submarine expertise. Soviet naval officers toured the captured boats with intense focus, photographing every detail and interrogating German engineers who had worked on their construction. The Soviets understood that their own submarine fleet lagged behind Western designs, and the German Type 31 offered a shortcut to technological parity. Meanwhile, the captured German crews endured long months of captivity. Some were interrogated for intelligence, particularly engineers familiar with new propulsion systems or torpedo technology. Allied interrogators treated them not as prisoners of war in the traditional sense, but as sources of technical knowledge. These sessions could be extensive. One engineer, Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, a veteran U-boat ace who had commanded U-96 during its famous war patrols, spent weeks describing the Type 23's construction methods and operational characteristics. His cooperation, while controversial among his fellow prisoners, provided Allied navies with crucial insights. Others languished in camps, uncertain of their fates. The ordinary crewmen, the mechanics and torpedomen who had kept the boats running, had little intelligence value and simply waited for repatriation. Conditions varied widely. British camps generally provided adequate food and shelter, though the psychological toll of captivity wore on men who had survived years of combat stress. By late 1945, most were repatriated to a defeated, divided Germany, returning to bombed cities and uncertain futures. The submariners who had once been celebrated as heroes now found themselves in a nation that wanted to forget its military past. By year's end, harbours from Trondheim to Portsmouth were clogged. with captured submarines. The Royal Navy's storage capacity was stretched to its limit. Submarines lay moored in rows, their hulls gradually deteriorating in the saltwater. The once feared U-boat fleet was now a logistical burden. Allied planners realized that keeping these vessels indefinitely was neither practical nor desirable. The decision was made. Most would have to be destroyed. What came next, Operation Deadlight, would ensure that the majority of these machines never sailed again. The operation took its name from nautical terminology. Deadlights referred to the storm shutters that covered a ship's portholes during heavy weather, sealing them against the sea. It was a fitting metaphor for what was to come, sealing away Germany's submarine fleet forever beneath the waves. By the autumn of 1945, the Allies had gathered more than 100 surrendered U-boats in British harbours. Keeping them afloat was costly, and storing them indefinitely was impossible. The Royal Navy therefore approved Operation Deadlight, a plan to tow the captured submarines out into the Atlantic and sink them. Between November 1945 and February 1946, this quiet operation would erase most of the Kriegsmarine's undersea fleet from existence. The logistics were daunting. In total, 156 U-boats had surrendered to the Allies, with 116 designated for destruction under Deadlight. The Royal Navy divided the operation into 3 dumping areas, designated XX, YY, and ZZ, roughly 100 to 120 nautical miles northwest of Ireland. There, the submarines would be sunk either by naval gunfire, explosive charges, or by simply opening their sea valves and letting the Atlantic claim them. The locations were chosen for their depth and remoteness from shipping lanes. No one wanted submarines blocking navigation channels or washing up on beaches years later. The first phase began in November 1945 when Royal Navy tugs started towing groups of submarines from Scottish and Irish ports, but many of the U-boats were in dreadful condition. Some had been at sea for months without maintenance, others were battered by Allied bombing or deliberate sabotage. Their ballast tanks leaked, their engines seized, and their hulls were weakened by rust and corrosion. In stormy winter seas, towing these unstable wrecks was a hazardous task. The tugs often had to proceed at little more than walking pace to avoid swamping the submarines they were towing. When storms struck, as they frequently did in the North Atlantic autumn, the tow lines would snap and submarines would drift helplessly until they could be secured again. As a result, more than a third of the U-boats never made it to the scuttling zones. 56 vessels foundered or sank on the way, dragged down by rough weather or structural failure. The Royal Navy recorded each loss, but made little effort to recover them. Deadlight's purpose was destruction, not preservation. In a sense, the ocean itself was completing the job that Allied depth charges had begun years earlier. These unintended sinkings scattered wrecks across a wide area of the North Atlantic, creating an accidental underwater graveyard that would only be rediscovered decades later. Once in position, destroyers and frigates finished the job. Crews sometimes used aerial rockets or naval gunfire to ensure the boats went under quickly. The preferred method was to open the submarine's main ballast tank vents, flooding the chambers that normally kept the vessel buoyant. Within minutes, the submarine would slip beneath the surface, often stern first, air bubbling from its hatches as it descended into the darkness. Sailors who witnessed these sinkings described them as strangely anticlimactic. The boats that had once prowled the Atlantic with such menace now vanished without ceremony, victims of their own rusted seams and the cold North Atlantic waters. Among the doomed submarines was U-2336, the last U-boat to sink Allied ships during the war. This Type 53 coastal submarine had torpedoed 2 British merchant vessels, the Snelland Fansan and the Avondale Park, on the 7th of May 1945, just hours before the German surrender took effect. Her commander, Oberleutnant zur See Emil Klusmeyer, had been unaware that capitulation was imminent when he pressed home his attacks in the Firth of Forth. When he received the surrender order the following day, Klusmeyer dutifully surfaced and sailed to Lissahalli, where U-2336 was formally handed over on the 3rd of June, 1945. After months of storage and evaluation, the boat was towed out for deliberate destruction in January 1946, sunk by gunfire from Royal Navy vessels. Its final resting place lies somewhere in the designated Scuttling zones northwest of Ireland, a steel coffin for the last offensive action of Germany's submarine war. Another notable casualty was U-295, a Type CC boat that had seen extensive service in Arctic. waters. Under the command of various captains throughout the war, U-295 had participated in operations against Allied convoys bound for the Soviet Union via Murmansk. The boat surrendered at Narvik, Norway in May 1945 and was subsequently moved to Loch Ryan in Scotland. On the 17th of December 1945, after being stripped of useful equipment and documentation, U-295 was towed out into the North Atlantic. Royal Navy gunners used it for target practice, firing dozens of shells into its hull before it finally slipped beneath the waves. The sinking was filmed for training purposes, providing naval gunners with valuable footage showing how different types of ordnance affected submarine hulls. U-277 met its end under similar circumstances. This boat had been commissioned late in the war in March 1944 and saw only limited action before Germany's collapse. Its relatively intact condition made it useful for Allied evaluation, and British engineers spent several months examining its diesel engines and electrical systems before condemning it for destruction. In January 1946, U-1277 was towed to the Scuttling grounds and sunk by opening its sea cocks. Unlike some boats that were bombarded until they sank, U-1277 was allowed to flood gradually, a more economical method when weather conditions permitted. The sinking of U-776 illustrated the dangers inherent in Operation Deadlight. This submarine, damaged during its final patrol, had been barely seaworthy when it surrendered in May 1945. British engineers had debated whether it was even safe to tow, given the extensive cracking visible in its pressure hull. Nevertheless, it was included in a convoy of boats being moved from Loch Ryan to the Scuttling zones in late November 1945. During the voyage, heavy seas opened the hull cracks further, and U-776 began taking on water faster than its pumps could manage. The towing crew barely had time to cast off the line before the submarine rolled onto its side and sank, taking with it several pieces of Royal Navy equipment that hadn't been removed in time. The incident prompted stricter inspections of subsequent boats scheduled for towing. Not all the submarines destroyed in Operation Deadlight were ordinary combat boats. U-2511, Germany's only fully operational Type Funny Wine at the war's end, represented the pinnacle of wartime submarine design. Commanded by Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee, one of Germany's most decorated U-boat aces, with over 100,000 tons of Allied shipping to his credit, U-2511 had been conducting sea trials when the surrender order arrived. Schnee later claimed that during these final days he had successfully tracked a British cruiser squadron without being detected, proving the Type WW2's revolutionary capabilities. Whether this encounter actually occurred remains disputed by historians, but it demonstrated what might have been had these advanced submarines entered service earlier in the war. After surrender, U-2511 underwent exhaustive evaluation by Allied engineers. Every system was tested, every innovation documented. The boat's streamlined hull design, capable of sustaining 17 knots submerged, far exceeded anything in the Allied arsenal at the time. Its hydraulically loaded torpedo tubes could be reloaded in just 12 minutes, compared to the hour or more required by earlier U-boat types. The enhanced battery capacity allowed it to remain submerged for days without surfacing, making it nearly immune to the radar-equipped aircraft that had devastated the older U-boat fleet. British and American observers filled notebooks with technical drawings and performance data, recognizing that they were examining the template for the next generation of submarines. Despite its value as a research vessel, U-2511 was ultimately earmarked for destruction. The decision reflected both practical considerations and political symbolism. Maintaining the boat required German-trained personnel familiar with its complex systems, and Allied navies had already extracted the technical information they needed. Moreover, there was something fitting about destroying the most advanced U-boat, along with the rest of the fleet. On the 7th of February 1946, U-2511 was scuttled in the designated zone ZZ, marking the official conclusion of Operation Deadlight. Adalbert Schnee, by then a prisoner of war in Britain, reportedly felt the loss keenly, having considered U-2511 the finest submarine he had ever commanded. The human cost of the U-boat war remained present even in these final destruction operations. British sailors tasked with scuttling the submarines often found personal items still aboard. Family photographs tucked behind gauges, letters from wives and sweethearts stuffed in lockers, religious medallions hung above bunks. one Royal Navy boarding party discovered a diary written by a German machinist's mate, chronicling his experiences from 1942 through to the surrender. The entries began with enthusiastic descriptions of camaraderie and purpose, but grew increasingly despairing as the war turned against Germany. The final entry, dated the 6th of May 1945, simply read, "It is over. We have lost everything. What was it all for?" The diary was turned over to military intelligence, but not before several British sailors who read it remarked on the universal tragedy of young men sent to die in steel tubes beneath an unforgiving sea. The destruction continued through the winter months. By January 1946, more than 80 U-boats had been sent to the bottom in the designated scuttling zones. The Royal Navy maintained meticulous records of each sinking, noting the boat's identification number, the method of destruction, the approximate coordinates of its final position, and any notable incidents during the process. These records would prove invaluable decades later when maritime archaeologists began searching for the wrecks. However, at the time, they served mainly as bureaucratic documentation of a distasteful but necessary task. Weather proved to be one of the operation's greatest adversaries. The North Atlantic in winter is notoriously treacherous, with storms sweeping in from the polar regions with little warning. Several times, entire convoys of submarines being towed to the scuttling zones had to turn back and seek shelter when gale-force winds made further progress impossible. On one occasion, in early January 1946, 3 submarines being towed in formation were caught in a severe storm. The tow lines on 2 of them snapped almost simultaneously, and despite heroic efforts by the tug crews, both submarines drifted away into the darkness. One was later found washed up on rocks off the Hebrides, its hull split open. The other was never recovered and presumably sank in deep water somewhere in the North Atlantic, its final resting place unknown and unrecorded. The psychological impact on the British and American sailors conducting Operation Deadlight was significant, though rarely discussed in official reports. These men were, after all, deliberately destroying vessels that had been their enemies only months before. Some took satisfaction in the work, viewing it as a final victory over the U-boats that had killed so many Allied merchant seamen. Others felt it was wasteful and even disrespectful, regardless of which side the submarines had served. One British lieutenant, assigned to supervise the scuttling of a group of Type 7 boats, later wrote in his memoir, "We had fought these machines for 6 years, hunted them across thousands of miles of ocean, celebrated when we sank them. Now we were sinking them ourselves, but there was no celebration, only a strange sense of melancholy." They had been beautiful in their way, these steel sharks. Deadly, yes, but beautiful. The operation also provided unexpected training opportunities. Allied navies used the condemned submarines to test various weapons and tactics. Depth. Charges were dropped near submerged hulls to study their effectiveness against different submarine types. New torpedo designs were test-fired at stationary targets, providing valuable data on warhead performance and guidance systems. Anti-submarine rockets, a technology that had matured late in the war, were used extensively against the U-boats, with observers carefully noting penetration depths and damage patterns. In this way, the defeated German submarine fleet contributed one final time to naval warfare development, albeit as targets rather than weapons. By the time Operation Deadlight concluded in February 1946, 116 U-boats had been destroyed in the designated zones. Another 56 had sunk accidentally during towing operations, scattered across the approaches to the scuttling areas. The total exceeded 170 submarines sent to the seabed in just 4 months. It was the most concentrated submarine destruction operation in naval history, dwarfing even the losses inflicted during the height of the Allied anti-submarine campaign. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet, which had numbered over 1,000 boats by war's end and had sent more than 3,000 Allied ships to the bottom, was now itself becoming part of the ocean floor. The final submarine destroyed under Operation Deadlight was, appropriately, the advanced U-2511 that Adalbert Schnee had commanded. Its sinking on the 7th of February 1946 represented not just the end of an operation, but the symbolic conclusion of an entire chapter in naval warfare. With U-2511's disappearance beneath the waves, the era of the diesel-electric submarine as a decisive weapon had effectively ended. Nuclear power would soon revolutionize undersea warfare, but the principles learned from Germany's Type 21 design would inform submarine construction for decades to come. The destruction, however, was not total. Even as Operation Deadlight proceeded, Allied planners had set aside select vessels for detailed examination. These submarines, representing the most advanced German designs and technologies, would not be sunk, but rather studied, tested, and in some cases integrated into Allied navies. The decision to preserve these boats reflected a clear-eyed assessment of their strategic value. The Cold War was already emerging, and the technological advantages contained in Germany's submarine fleet were too valuable to simply destroy. What had been enemy weapons would now become teachers, their secrets dissected and absorbed into the naval arsenals of the victorious powers. The Royal Navy retained several Type 22 boats and Type 23 submarines for evaluation. British engineers were particularly interested in the snorkel technology that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, drawing air from the surface through a retractable tube fitted with a valve to prevent flooding. This innovation, originally developed by the Dutch before the war but perfected by Germany, eliminated the need for submarines to surface regularly to recharge their batteries. The British had encountered snorkel-equipped U-boats during the final year of the war and had found them maddeningly difficult to detect and destroy. Now they had the opportunity to study the technology firsthand and incorporate it into their own designs. U-3017, a Type WW2 boat, was among those selected for British evaluation. Renamed HMS N41, it underwent extensive trials in British waters throughout 1946 and 1947. Royal Navy crews practiced operating its hydraulic torpedo loading system, tested its underwater handling characteristics, and measured its actual performance against the specifications captured in German documents. The trials confirmed what Allied intelligence had feared. The Type 21 was indeed a formidable vessel, capable of sustained underwater speeds that would have made it extremely difficult to counter with existing anti-submarine weapons. British submarine designers incorporated many of U-3017's features into their next generation of boats, including the streamlined hull shape and improved battery layout. After serving its purpose, U-3017 was scrapped in 1949. Its steel recycled, but its influence lasting far longer. The United States Navy took similar interest in captured German technology. Several U-boats were transported across the Atlantic to American naval facilities for evaluation. U-2513, another Type WW2 submarine, made the journey to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire, where American submarine officers and engineers examined it with intense focus. The boat's advanced features impressed them deeply. One American submarine commander who toured U-253 reported back to his superiors, "This vessel represents a quantum leap in submarine design. If Germany had deployed even 50 of these a year earlier, the Battle of the Atlantic might have had a very different outcome." American interest extended beyond pure technology. The United States Navy was particularly concerned with understanding how German crews had operated under the extreme stress of prolonged underwater operations. Interviews with captured German submariners revealed sophisticated approaches to crew psychology, watch scheduling, and stress management that American submarine forces quickly adopted. The Germans had learned through bitter experience how to keep crews functional during extended patrols in cramped, dangerous conditions. These lessons, though born from desperation, proved valuable for the expanding American submarine fleet. U-505 occupied a unique position among captured submarines. Unlike the boats that surrendered in May 1945, U-505 had been captured intact in combat on the 4th of June 1944 off the coast of West Africa. A task force led by the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal had depth-charged the submarine to the surface, then boarded it before the crew could complete their scuttling procedures. This capture, the first of an enemy warship by the United States Navy since the War of 1812, provided immediate intelligence benefits. The Enigma machine and codebooks recovered from U-505 contributed to Allied code-breaking efforts, though this remained classified for decades after the war. After the war, U-505's fate hung in balance. Some naval officers advocated for its destruction, arguing that it served no further purpose. Others wanted to preserve it as a war trophy. The debate continued until Captain Daniel Gallery, who had commanded the task force that captured the submarine, launched a campaign to save it. Gallery envisioned U-505 becoming a permanent memorial and museum, educating future generations about the submarine war. His persistence eventually succeeded. In 1954, U-505 was donated to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. The submarine was transported from its berth in Portsmouth through the Great Lakes, then hauled overland through Chicago streets in an extraordinary engineering feat. Today, it remains on display, meticulously restored, the only German submarine in the United States, and a tangible link to the Battle of the Atlantic. Canada also benefited from the captured submarines. U-190, a Type Y-C boat that had surrendered off Newfoundland in May 1945, was commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy and used for anti-submarine warfare training. Canadian naval officers gained valuable experience operating a submarine designed by their former enemies, learning its strengths and weaknesses firsthand. U-190 served in this capacity for 2 years before being deliberately sunk as a target in 1947. Its wreck now lies off Nova Scotia, occasionally visited by divers interested in its history. The Soviet Union's acquisition of German submarine technology would prove to have the most far-reaching consequences. Under the terms of the Tripartite Naval Commission, formed in August 1945, the Allies agreed to divide the captured U-boat fleet. Among the major powers, the Soviet Union received 10 submarines, including several of the prized Type WW2 boats. Soviet naval architects and engineers studied these vessels with obsessive attention to detail, understanding that they represented a shortcut to closing the technological gap with Western navies. Soviet shipyards in Leningrad and Severodvinsk received the captured Type WW2 submarines and immediately began systematic reverse engineering. Teams of naval architects measured every dimension, photographed every component, and tested every system. The pressure hull construction in particular fascinated Soviet engineers. German welding techniques had produced hull sections capable of withstanding pressures at depths that Soviet submarines of the time could not reach. The secrets lay in the metallurgy, the welding procedures, and the quality control processes that German yards had refined through years of trial and error. The hydraulic systems that powered the Type WW2's rapid torpedo reloading particularly impressed the Soviets. Traditional submarines required manual labor and considerable time to reload torpedo tubes, limiting their rate of fire in combat. The Type WW2's automated system could prepare 6 torpedoes for firing in less than 15 minutes, giving it firepower equivalent to several conventional submarines. Soviet designers incorporated similar systems into their Project 6-1-1 submarines, which NATO would later designate the Whiskey class. These boats, first launched in 1949, bore unmistakable German influence in their hull shapes, battery arrangements, and propulsion systems. However, the technology transfer came with challenges. German engineering documentation used measurement systems, technical terminology, and construction standards unfamiliar to Soviet shipyards. Translating not just the language but the entire engineering philosophy required extensive collaboration with German technical personnel. Many German submarine engineers who had fallen into Soviet hands after the war found themselves working in Soviet design bureaus, sometimes willingly, sometimes under compulsion. Their expertise proved invaluable in bridging the gap between German innovation and Soviet production capabilities. One such engineer, whose name remains classified in Russian archives, spent 3 years in Leningrad explaining the intricacies of snorkel valve design to Soviet counterparts. The valve had to seal instantly when waves washed over the snorkel head, preventing seawater from flooding the submarine's interior, yet open quickly enough when the wave passed to maintain engine operation. The German design achieved this through a complex interplay of float mechanisms, spring tensions, and drainage channels. Soviet attempts to simplify the design for mass production initially resulted in several dangerous flooding incidents during trials. Only by adhering more closely to the German specifications did they achieve reliable operation. The British and Americans faced fewer obstacles in adopting German technology, but they were no less thorough in their examination. At Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, American engineers disassembled U-213 piece by piece, creating detailed technical drawings of every component. The submarine's electric motors, designed to operate quietly at slow speeds for stalking targets, revealed clever approaches to reducing noise transmission through the hull. American submarine designers had struggled with this problem for years, knowing that excessive noise made submarines vulnerable to sonar detection. The German solution involved mounting motors on rubber cushions and using specially designed propeller blades that minimized cavitation. The British, meanwhile, focused heavily on the Type 20 points battery systems. Extending underwater endurance had been a limiting factor in submarine operations throughout the war. German engineers had addressed this by increasing battery capacity and improving battery management systems. They had also developed more efficient DC motors that could extract maximum range from available power. Royal Navy submarine designers incorporated these lessons into their post-war T-class and A-class submarines, significantly improving their operational capabilities. French naval engineers also benefited from access to captured German technology. France, rebuilding its navy after years of occupation and the controversial circumstances of the Vichy regime, received several U-boats from Allied stockpiles. The French Navy had been devastated during the war, losing vessels to British attacks after the fall of France, to scuttling in Toulon in 1942, and to general wartime attrition. The captured German submarines provided both immediate operational capability and a foundation for indigenous submarine development. U-123, a Type Might-Be boat that had conducted several highly successful patrols in American coastal waters during 1942, was among those transferred to French service. Renamed Blaisson, this submarine served in the French Navy through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. French naval crews trained aboard it, learning submarine operations and tactics from a vessel designed by the Kriegsmarine's most experienced submarine architects. When Blaisson was finally decommissioned, the French Navy chose to preserve it rather than scrap it, recognizing its historical significance. The submarine now rests in Lorient, one of the former German U-boat bases on the French Atlantic coast, serving as a museum ship and memorial. Norway, occupied by Germany throughout the war and host to numerous German U-boat bases, acquired several submarines for coastal defense and training purposes. The Norwegian Navy had emerged from the occupation with limited assets and saw the captured U-boats as an economical way to re-establish submarine capability. Several Type 7C boats were recommissioned into Norwegian service, their crews trained by former German submariners who had chosen to remain in Norway after the war. These submarines served primarily in defensive roles, patrolling Norwegian coastal waters during the early Cold War period, when Soviet naval activity in the region was a constant concern. Denmark similarly acquired German submarine technology for its post-war shipbuilding programs. Danish naval architects studied the captured submarines with an eye toward developing indigenous designs suitable for Baltic Sea operations. The shallow, confined waters of the Baltic required submarines with different characteristics than those optimized for Atlantic operations. German coastal submarines, particularly the Type Thor boats, provided valuable insights into designing vessels for such environments. Yet not every technology transfer was purely scientific or defensive in nature. The redistribution of U-boats quickly became entangled in post-war geopolitics. Britain and the United States had initially hoped that sharing German technology would maintain balance and cooperation among the Allies, continuing the wartime partnership into peacetime. However, as tensions with the Soviet Union mounted and the Cold War began in earnest, this hope proved naive. The Soviet Union's aggressive acquisition and reverse engineering of German submarine technology alarmed Western military planners. Intelligence reports from the late 1940s documented rapid expansion of the Soviet submarine fleet, with new construction clearly based on captured German designs. The same engineering that had threatened Allied convoys during World War II was now fueling a potential adversary's naval buildup. What Britain and America had shared in good faith with an ally was becoming a strategic liability as that ally transformed into an adversary. This development influenced Western submarine design philosophy throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. American and British submarine programs increasingly focused not just on incorporating German innovations, but on developing countermeasures to submarines built using those same innovations. Anti-submarine warfare research intensified, with particular attention to detecting quiet, streamlined submarines like the Type San. Sonar technology advanced rapidly, torpedo guidance systems improved, and new depth charge designs emerged, all driven partly by the knowledge that potential enemies now possessed German-derived submarine technology. The geopolitical complications extended beyond the major powers. Several nations that remained neutral during World War II expressed interest in acquiring German submarine technology. Argentina, which had accepted the surrender of U-977 in August 1945, initially hoped to retain the submarine for its own navy. Argentine naval officers recognized that modern submarine capability would enhance their country's maritime power in the South Atlantic. However, under pressure from the United States, which suspected Argentina of harboring Nazi sympathizers and wanted to prevent the spread of advanced military technology, Argentina ultimately surrendered U-977 to American custody. Similar dynamics played out with other neutral nations. Spain, under Francisco Franco's authoritarian regime, inquired about acquiring U-boats from Allied stockpiles. Franco's government had maintained friendly relations with Nazi Germany throughout the war, and Spanish ports had occasionally provided covert support to U-boats operating in the Atlantic. The prospect of Spanish acquisition of German submarine technology alarmed the Allies, who had no desire to see advanced military equipment fall into the hands of a fascist government, with sympathies toward the defeated Axis powers. Spain's requests were politely but firmly refused. Turkey, a neutral power that had joined the Allies only in the war's final months, expressed interest in captured German submarines to modernize its aging fleet. Turkey occupied a crucial strategic position, controlling the Dardanelles and Bosphorus straits that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The Soviets, whose Black Sea fleet depended on access through these straits, watched Turkish military development with intense concern. After considerable diplomatic maneuvering, Turkey did eventually acquire several submarines, though not German boats. Instead, the United States transferred American-built submarines to Turkish service, maintaining influence over Turkish naval development while avoiding the complications of German technology transfer. The story of individual U-boats during this period often reflected broader geopolitical tensions. U-2513, the Type 31 boat that American engineers had studied so thoroughly, was eventually used as a target in weapons tests. In 1951, it was deliberately sunk by aerial torpedoes off Key West, Florida. The tests served dual purposes, validating new American anti-submarine weapons and ensuring that Soviet intelligence could not gain access to an intact Type 24 boat in Western hands. Even 6 years after the war's end, the technological secrets contained in these submarines remained sensitive enough to warrant their complete destruction once their research value had been extracted. The human dimension of these technology transfers should not be overlooked. German engineers and submariners who found themselves working for the Allies faced complex moral and practical dilemmas. Some cooperated enthusiastically, grateful for the opportunity to continue their professional work and viewing their new employers as preferable to Soviet captivity. Others cooperated reluctantly, motivated primarily by survival and the hope of eventual return to Germany. A few refused to cooperate entirely, spending additional years in prisoner-of-war camps rather than assist former enemies. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, the decorated U-boat ace who had commanded U-96 during its famous Ninth War Patrol, later dramatized in the film Das Boot, exemplified the cooperative approach. After his capture in May 1945, Lehmann-Willenbrock spent months answering Allied questions about submarine operations, tactics, and training. He provided detailed information about crew selection processes, explaining how the Kriegsmarine had identified and trained submariners capable of withstanding the psychological stress of underwater warfare. This information proved valuable to Allied navies developing their own submarine forces for the emerging Cold War. Lehmann-Willenbrock's cooperation did not stem from ideological conversion, but from practical recognition that the war was over, and that his knowledge might as well serve a purpose rather than mouldering in a prison camp. Other German submariners proved less cooperative. Kapitän zur See Werner Hartmann, who had commanded several U-boats during the war and served in U-boat command positions, refused to provide technical information to Soviet interrogators after his capture. Hartmann spent nearly a decade in Soviet captivity, enduring harsh conditions in prison camps, before finally being repatriated to West Germany in 1955. His stubbornness, while principled, meant he suffered years of additional captivity that might have been avoided through cooperation. The experience of captured German submarine crews varied widely depending on which Allied power held them. British captivity generally provided reasonable conditions, though German submariners were held longer than other prisoners of war due to their specialized knowledge. American captivity was often more comfortable, with better food and accommodation, though interrogations could be intensive. Soviet captivity was notably harsher, with former U-boat personnel facing years of forced labor in addition to technical interrogation. Many German submariners captured by Soviet forces did not return home until the mid-1950s, a full decade after the war's end. The families of these captured submariners faced uncertain fates in occupied Germany. With the country divided into occupation zones and millions displaced by the war's devastation, wives and children often had no way of knowing whether their husbands and fathers had survived. The German submarine service had suffered catastrophic casualty rates, with approximately 30,000 of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats killed during the war. This 75% loss rate exceeded that of any other German military branch and made submarine service the deadliest duty in the Wehrmacht. When survivors finally returned home in the late 1940s and early 1950s, they found a country transformed. Germany was divided, impoverished, and attempting to distance itself from its Nazi past. The U-boat men who had once been celebrated as heroes now found themselves in a society that wanted to forget the war entirely. Many struggled to reintegrate, haunted by their experiences and finding that their specialized skills had little value in peacetime Germany. Some found work in the merchant marine or in civilian shipbuilding. Others changed careers entirely, leaving their naval past behind. Karl Dönitz, the former U-boat commander who had built the submarine fleet and briefly succeeded Hitler as Germany's head of state, faced a different fate. Tried at Nuremberg for war crimes, including charges related to unrestricted submarine warfare, Dönitz was convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. His sentence proved controversial. The prosecution argued that Germany's policy of attacking merchant ships without warning violated international law. The defense countered that all combatant nations had practiced similar tactics during the war, including the United States and the Pacific Theater. American Admiral Chester Nimitz even provided a statement acknowledging that the US Navy had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan from the war's first day. Despite this defense, Dönitz was convicted, though he received a relatively lenient sentence compared to other Nazi leaders. He served his full term in Spandau prison in Berlin, released in 1956. After his release, Dönitz lived quietly in northern Germany, occasionally meeting with former U-boat commanders but generally avoiding public attention. He remained unrepentant about his wartime service, viewing his actions as those of a naval officer following orders and doing his duty. He died in 1980 at age 89, one of the last senior Nazi military commanders to pass away. The legacy of the U-boat fleet extended beyond the individual submariners and the technology they had operated. The submarine warfare campaign had fundamentally altered naval strategy and forced the development of entirely new categories of military technology. Radar, sonar, depth charges, hedgehog mortars, escort carriers, and long-range patrol aircraft had all been developed or significantly improved in response to the U-boat threat. These technologies remained relevant in the Cold War era, adapted for new purposes, but rooted in the lessons learned battling German submarines in the Atlantic. The convoy system, refined through painful experience during World War II, became standard doctrine for protecting maritime supply lines. NATO naval exercises throughout the Cold War regularly practiced convoy operations, anticipating that Soviet submarines would pose similar threats to Atlantic shipping in any future conflict. The organizational structures, communication protocols, and tactical procedures developed to counter U-boats provided the foundation for anti-submarine warfare throughout the nuclear age. The captured U-boats also contributed to civilian maritime technology development. Snorkel technology, developed for military submarines, eventually found applications in civilian diving equipment and underwater research vessels. Hull design principles learned from German submarines influenced commercial ship construction, particularly for vessels operating in rough seas. The materials science advances that produced stronger, more resilient submarine hulls benefited civilian shipbuilding across multiple industries. Several Allied nations established submarine museums featuring captured or preserved German boats, recognizing their historical significance and educational value. These museums served multiple purposes, honoring the sacrifices of Allied merchant and naval personnel, educating the public about submarine warfare, and preserving tangible examples of World War II military technology. The submarines themselves became classrooms, allowing visitors to experience firsthand the cramped, challenging conditions in which both German and Allied submariners had operated. U-505's preservation in Chicago proved particularly significant. Captain Daniel Gallery's vision of the submarine as an educational tool has been realized for 7 decades. Millions of visitors have walked through its narrow passages, viewed its control room and torpedo, tubes, and gained some appreciation for the reality of submarine warfare. The boat underwent extensive restoration in 2004, moved indoors to protect it from weathering, and placed in a climate-controlled environment to ensure its preservation for future generations. Interactive exhibits surrounding the submarine tell the broader story of the Battle of the Atlantic, placing U-505's individual story within the larger historical context. Similar preservation efforts occurred elsewhere. U-995 at Laboe, Germany, provides European visitors with comparable experiences. The Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow displays a Soviet submarine clearly influenced by captured German technology, though Soviet authorities were long reluctant to acknowledge this debt. In Britain, HMS Alliance, a British submarine incorporating German design elements, serves as a museum at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport, Hampshire, representing the post-war synthesis of Allied and German submarine technology. The fate of the submarines that evaded Operation Deadlight and Allied capture created lasting mysteries and occasional discoveries. Several U-boats that surrendered in isolated locations were never formally accounted for in Allied records. Some may have been scuttled by their crews before Allied forces arrived. Others might have been taken over by local authorities and their ultimate dispositions lost in bureaucratic confusion. Rumors persisted for decades about U-boats that escaped to South America, hidden in remote locations, or absorbed into Argentine and Chilean naval forces. These rumors had some basis in fact. U-977's journey to Argentina was well documented, and U-530 followed a similar path, arriving at Mar del Plata in July 1945. However, wild speculation about these boats transporting Nazi gold, senior officials, or even Hitler himself to South American hideouts far exceeded the mundane reality. Both submarines underwent thorough searches upon arrival, revealing nothing more exotic than exhausted crews and depleted supplies. Nevertheless, the mysterious South American U-boats became fixtures of conspiracy theories and popular culture, appearing in novels, films, and television programs for decades. The wrecks from Operation Deadlight remained largely forgotten until the turn of the 21st century. Maritime archaeologist Innes McCartney became fascinated with the Deadlight scuttling zones during the 1990s while researching Atlantic war graves. Using historical records from the Royal Navy, he identified the approximate locations where U-boats had been deliberately sunk. Between 2001 and 2003, McCartney led expeditions to these areas using side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles to search for the wrecks. The expeditions proved remarkably successful. McCartney's team identified at least 14 intact U-boat hulls resting on the seabed at depths ranging from 100 to 180 meters. The cold North Atlantic waters and mud had preserved the wrecks remarkably well. Sonar images showed submarines sitting upright on the bottom, their conning towers still prominent, their hulls largely intact despite more than 50 years underwater. Some wrecks showed damage consistent with their destruction methods, with holes blown in pressure hulls or stern sections missing where scuttling charges had been placed. Others appeared surprisingly complete, suggesting they had sunk due to flooding rather than explosive demolition. These discoveries generated significant interest among maritime historians and submarine enthusiasts. The wrecks represented a time capsule from the immediate post-war period, preserving not just the submarines themselves, but also the hasty conditions under which they had been destroyed. McCartney's work documented the exact locations of specific boats, matching hull numbers visible on sonar scans with Royal Navy records to identify individual submarines. U-11 Tie 5, U-2346, U-683, and several others were positively identified through this process. The discovery also raised ethical questions about underwater war graves. While the Operation Deadlight submarines had been sunk empty of crew, they remained German naval vessels, and thus arguably still under German sovereignty, according to international maritime law. The wrecks also represented environmental concerns, as their steel hulls continued to corrode, potentially releasing fuel oil and other contaminants. Some advocates called for removal or remediation, while others argued that the submarines should be left undisturbed as historical sites and environmental monitoring should suffice. German authorities ultimately took the position that the wrecks should remain where they were, serving as underwater memorials to the submariners who had served in the U-boat fleet. This approach aligned with similar policies regarding other World War II shipwrecks, which are generally protected from salvage or disturbance unless environmental hazards require intervention. Recreational diving on the Deadlight wrecks is officially discouraged due to their depth and the challenging conditions, though some technical divers have visited the shallower sites. The rediscovery of the Deadlight wrecks prompted renewed historical interest in Operation Deadlight itself. Previously a relatively obscure footnote to World War II history, the Scuttling operation received fresh scholarly attention. Historians examined the decision-making process that led to the submarine's destruction, the logistics of the operation, and the immediate post-war political context. The operation emerged as an important example of how victorious powers handled captured military technology in the transition from wartime to peacetime, offering lessons relevant to later conflicts. The technology contained in the captured U-boats influenced submarine design throughout the Cold War era and beyond. American submarines built in the late 1940s and 1950s incorporated numerous features derived from German designs. The Tang-class submarines, commissioned beginning in 1951, featured streamlined hulls clearly influenced by the type Feuilletons, though adapted for American construction methods and operational requirements. These boats represented a transitional design between traditional diesel-electric submarines and the nuclear-powered boats that would follow. Soviet submarine development followed a similar trajectory, but with closer adherence to German templates. The Whiskey-class submarines that entered service starting in 1949 were virtual copies of the type Feuilletons, adapted only where Soviet production capabilities required modifications. The Soviet Union built over 230 Whiskey-class boats, making them the most numerous submarines of their era and spreading German submarine technology throughout the Soviet sphere of influence. Several Whiskey-class boats were later transferred to China, Egypt, Poland, and other Soviet client states, extending the German design influence even further. British submarine development also bore German influence, but incorporated it more subtly into indigenous designs. The Porpoise and Oberon classes, developed in the 1950s and 1960s respectively, featured quiet operations and extended underwater endurance, clearly inspired by German innovations, but packaged in distinctly British designs optimized for British operational doctrine. These submarines served with the Royal Navy well into the 1990s and were exported to numerous countries including Australia, Canada, and Brazil, further disseminating submarine technology rooted in World War II German engineering. The transition to nuclear power in the 1950s might have seemed to render German diesel-electric submarine technology obsolete, but this proved not to be the case. Nuclear submarines, while revolutionary in their virtually unlimited underwater endurance, were expensive and complex. Many navies could not afford or did not need nuclear boats. For these forces, improved diesel-electric submarines remained the practical choice. The design principles established by the type WW2, refined through decades of development, continued to influence conventional submarine construction into the 21st century. Modern conventional submarines still bear the mark of German wartime innovation. The emphasis on quiet operation, streamlined hull design, and efficient battery management can be traced directly to the type Feuilletons influence. Even advanced systems like air-independent propulsion, which allows modern conventional submarines to operate underwater for weeks without surfacing, build upon the foundation established by German engineers trying to solve similar challenges 80 years ago. The intellectual lineage from the Kriegsmarine's design bureaus to contemporary shipyards remains clear to those familiar with submarine engineering history. The commercial applications of submarine technology, developed during World War II, extended into unexpected areas. Pressure hull construction techniques influenced deep-sea diving equipment and underwater habitat design. The electrical systems developed for submarines, which had to operate reliably in corrosive saltwater environments while conserving limited power, provided models for other marine applications. Torpedo guidance systems influenced the development of underwater robotics and autonomous vehicles. The web of innovation stretched far beyond military applications. Individual stories of U-boat veterans in the post-war era illustrated the complex personal legacies of the submarine war. Reinhard Hardigan, commander of U-123 during its devastating raids along the American coast in early 1942, returned to Germany after the war and built a successful career in business and local politics. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime service, but remained connected with other U-boat veterans through reunions and correspondence. When asked late in life about his feelings regarding the merchant seaman killed by his torpedoes, Hardigan expressed regret for the loss of life while maintaining that he had simply been a naval officer doing his duty in wartime. Otto Kretschmer, the most successful U-boat ace with over 270,000 tons of Allied shipping sunk, spent the war's final years as a prisoner of war in Canada after his submarine U-99 was depth-charged and forced to surface in March 1941. After repatriation in 1947, Kretschmer joined West Germany's new navy, the Bundesmarine, when it was established in the 1950s. He eventually rose to the rank of Flotillenadmiral before retiring in 1970. His post-war service symbolized West Germany's integration into NATO and the transformation of former enemies into Cold War allies. Kretschmer maintained correspondence with several British naval officers who had fought against him, meeting with them occasionally to discuss their shared experiences. He died in 1998, having made peace with his wartime enemies even if he never entirely reconciled his own feelings about the war. Not all U-boat veterans fared as well. Many struggled with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though such terminology did not exist at the time. The psychological toll of spending months in a submarine, knowing that a single depth charge or torpedo could kill the entire crew instantly, marked survivors indelibly. Some turned to alcohol. Others withdrew from social contact. The especially high casualty rate among U-boat crews meant that survivors often felt guilt about their survival when so many of their comrades had died. These psychological wounds, while invisible, proved as lasting as any physical injury. The memorial culture surrounding the U-boat service evolved significantly over the decades. Immediately after the war, Germany's defeat and the revelation of Nazi atrocities made any commemoration of German military service controversial. Veterans organizations formed quietly, often meeting privately rather than holding public ceremonies. As years passed and West Germany established itself as a democratic state and NATO ally, attitudes gradually shifted. By the 1960s and 1970s, commemorating those who had died in the submarine service became more accepted, distinguished from celebrating the Nazi regime they had served. The Marine Ehrenmal at Labo, originally constructed in 1936 as a memorial to German sailors lost in World War I, was expanded after World War II to honor those lost in the second conflict as well. The memorial stands as a tall stone tower overlooking Kiel Harbour, visible for miles around. The names of thousands of U-boat crewmen who never returned are inscribed on its walls. The presence of U-995 as a museum ship adjacent to the memorial creates a physical connection between abstract commemoration and tangible historical artifact. Visitors can pay respects to the dead, then walk through an actual submarine to gain some understanding of the conditions in which those men served and died. The preserved U-boats that escaped destruction represent only a fraction of the fleet that once terrorized the Atlantic, but each tells a unique story worth examining in detail. These survivors serve as tangible connections to a vanished world of underwater warfare, their steel hulls bearing witness to events that shaped the 20th century. U-534, now displayed in Birkenhead, England, had one of the most dramatic post-war histories of any preserved submarine. Commissioned in December 1942, this type Windsea boat conducted several war patrols before being caught by Allied forces in the Kattegat Strait on the 5th of May 1945, just 3 days before Germany's surrender. RAF aircraft attacked the submarine with depth charges, forcing it to the surface. Unwilling to surrender, the commander ordered the submarine scuttled. U-534 sank in relatively shallow water, settling on the seabed at a depth of approximately 60 meters, where it would remain for nearly half a century. The circumstances of U-534's final patrol sparked considerable speculation over the years. Why was it in the Kattegat so late in the war? Where had it been heading? What was it carrying? These questions went unanswered until the submarine was raised in 1993, using massive inflatable bags in a complex salvage operation. When the hull broke the surface after 48 years underwater, media speculation ran wild with theories about Nazi gold, stolen artwork, or escaping high-ranking officials. The reality, discovered after careful examination, proved both more mundane and more fascinating. U-534's hold contained routine military cargo, technical documents, spare parts, and personal belongings of the crew. However, the documents revealed that the submarine had been on a mission to evacuate important personnel and materials from Norway, which remained under German control longer than most of occupied Europe. The boat was heading toward northern Germany when attacked, attempting to complete its mission in the war's final chaotic days. The crew's personal effects, preserved by the cold Baltic water, offered poignant glimpses into their lives. Letters from families, photographs of loved ones, identification papers, even food containers still bearing traces of their last meals. The salvaged U-534 underwent extensive conservation before being prepared for display. Rather than attempting to restore it to pristine condition, conservators chose to preserve it largely as recovered, showing the effects of nearly 5 decades underwater. The hull was cut into sections to allow visitors to view the interior, revealing the cramped quarters where 50 men had lived and worked. The torpedo room, engine compartments, officer quarters, and control room all remained accessible, creating an immersive historical experience. The submarine's display in Birkenhead proved enormously popular, attracting visitors fascinated by both submarine technology and the human stories preserved within the hull. U-2540, later renamed Wilhelm Bauer, had an even more remarkable post-war career. This Type 22 submarine was scuttled by its crew in Flensburg Harbour on the 4th of May 1945 to prevent capture. It lay on the harbour bottom until 1957, when it was raised by the West German government. Rather than destroying it or turning it into a museum immediately, the Bundesmarine recommissioned the submarine for research and training purposes. For nearly a decade, Wilhelm Bauer served as a floating laboratory, allowing German naval engineers to study the Type WW2 design and conduct experiments in submarine operations. The decision to recommission a World War II U-boat proved controversial. Some viewed it as an inappropriate celebration of Germany's military past. Others saw it as a practical use of a valuable asset for scientific and educational purposes. The Bundesmarine maintained that Wilhelm Bauer served purely non-combat roles, functioning as a research platform rather than a weapons system. In 1982, after completing its research mission, the submarine was finally converted into a museum ship. It now resides in Bremerhaven, one of the best preserved examples of the Type WW2 design, and a testament to how remarkably advanced these submarines were for their era. U-461, a Type Versuchschiff supply submarine known as a milch cow, met a different fate. These large boats had been specifically designed to refuel and resupply combat U-boats at sea, extending their patrol range enormously. During the war, Allied forces prioritized destroying these supply submarines, recognizing that their elimination would force combat boats to return to base more frequently. U-461 was sunk by Allied aircraft in July 1943, long before the war's end. Its wreck was discovered by oil exploration surveys in the 1990s, lying in deep water off the coast of Spain. The wreck site has been designated a war grave and remains protected from disturbance, but the discovery provided valuable information about these specialized submarines, of which no examples were preserved after the war. The story of U-864 illustrated the dangers that some U-boats posed even decades after sinking. This Type 9D boat was torpedoed and sunk by the British submarine HMS Venturer off the coast of Norway in February 1945, while carrying a cargo of mercury intended for Japan. The submarine sank intact, with its cargo of mercury gradually corroding and leaking into the surrounding waters. Environmental monitoring in the 1990s revealed dangerous mercury contamination around the wreck site. After extensive study and debate, Norwegian authorities decided to entomb the wreck in sand and gravel to contain the mercury, a process completed in the 2010s. U-864 thus became perhaps the only U-boat to generate environmental concern and remediation efforts 70 years after its sinking. U-534 was not the only submarine to generate treasure hunter interest. U-864's Mercury cargo, while environmentally hazardous, held significant monetary value, leading to salvage proposals that environmental authorities rejected. Similar speculation surrounded U-853, sunk by American forces off Rhode Island on the 6th of May 1945, making it one of the last U-boats destroyed in combat. Diving on U-853 became popular among recreational divers once its location was confirmed, and over the years various artifacts have been recovered from the wreck, sometimes legally, sometimes not. The submarine, sitting in relatively shallow water, gradually deteriorated due to both natural corrosion and unauthorized salvage, prompting calls for better protection of underwater war graves. The technical sophistication of the Type 20 submarines, even by modern standards, became increasingly apparent as preserved examples were studied more thoroughly. Engineers examining U-2543 Wilhelm Bauer in Bremerhaven realized that the hydraulic systems, while designed in the 1940s, incorporated principles that remained current decades later. The boat's streamlined design, achieved through careful shaping of the hull and conning tower, created remarkably low drag underwater. Modern computational fluid dynamics analysis of the Type WW2 hull confirmed that German designers, working without computers or advanced simulation tools, had achieved near-optimal hydrodynamic forms through empirical testing and accumulated experience. The Type WW2's battery system proved equally impressive. The boat carried 372 massive lead-acid batteries weighing several tons in total, arranged in 2 battery rooms. These provided enough power to sustain 17 knots underwater for about 90 minutes, or 5 knots for nearly 60 hours. For comparison, contemporary American and British submarines could manage perhaps 9 knots for about 1 hour underwater before exhausting their batteries. This performance advantage meant a Type WW2 could outrun most Allied escorts while submerged, a capability that would have been devastating if fully exploited during the war. However, the Type WW2's sophistication came at a cost. Construction required precision manufacturing and high-quality materials, both increasingly scarce in Germany by 1944. The submarine's complexity made them difficult to maintain in the field, requiring skilled technicians and specialized tools. Many Type WW2 boats completed in the war's final months never became fully operational because the infrastructure needed to support them had been destroyed by Allied bombing. Of the 118 Type WW2 submarines commissioned, only 4 conducted war patrols, and none successfully engaged Allied shipping. The design's potential remained largely theoretical, demonstrated in trials and evaluations, but never proved in sustained combat operations. The fate of Germany's other submarine types varied considerably. The Type WW2 coastal submarines, small boats designed for operations in the Baltic and North Seas, mostly ended up scrapped or used as training vessels. Their limited range and capabilities made them less interesting for post-war study compared to the larger, more capable ocean-going types. The Type 7 workhorses that had borne the brunt of the Atlantic campaign either went to Operation Deadlight or were distributed among Allied navies for evaluation. Few were preserved. U-995 remains the only Type 7C submarine accessible to the public, making it invaluable for understanding the standard U-boat that dominated the Battle of the Atlantic. The Type 9 long-range submarines saw mixed fates. Their combination of endurance and payload made them valuable for studying long-range patrol capabilities. Several were retained by Allied navies for testing, while others were transferred to smaller navies looking to establish or rebuild submarine forces. U-123's preservation in France as Blazon, mentioned earlier, provided French naval crews with extended experience operating a proven design, though the submarine systems were showing their age by the time it was finally retired in the 1950s. The mine-laying submarines, Types X and XB, mostly met destruction in Operation Deadlight or weapons testing. Their specialized designs made them less generally useful for post-war navies, which could lay mines using surface vessels or aircraft more efficiently. U-234's capture with its controversial cargo made it an exception, carefully studied before being used as a target, and sunk. The debate over whether its uranium oxide cargo was truly intended for Japanese atomic research or simply for conventional industrial use has never been fully resolved. though most historians now believe the latter interpretation more likely. The psychological impact of submarine warfare continued to resonate long after the last U-boat was destroyed or preserved. Merchant seamen who survived U-boat attacks often carried lasting trauma. The terror of torpedo strikes, often occurring without warning at night, the struggle to escape, sinking ships in darkness, the hours or days spent in lifeboats hoping for rescue. These experiences marked survivors indelibly. Veterans organizations for merchant mariners became important support networks, and commemorative events honored the thousands of merchant seamen killed in the Atlantic campaign. Their sacrifice, sometimes overlooked compared to military casualties, was essential to Allied victory. Allied submarine forces also remembered their own losses with ceremonies and memorials. The United States Navy lost 52 submarines during World War II, with over 3,500 submariners killed. The Royal Navy lost 79 submarines with approximately 3,000 crew members. These losses, while significant, paled compared to the German submarine service's catastrophic casualties, but they reminded all involved that submarine warfare exacted terrible costs from both sides. Memorials to lost submarines often included mentions of enemy submarines, acknowledging that submariners on both sides faced similar dangers and shared similar fates beneath the waves. The evolution of submarine rescue and escape technology after World War II drew directly on lessons learned from U-boat losses. Many U-boats sank with survivors trapped inside, unable to escape from depths beyond their escape equipment's capabilities. The development of deep submergence rescue vehicles, improved escape suits, and emergency breathing systems in the post-war era aimed to prevent such tragedies in future conflicts. The Kursk disaster in 2000, when a Russian submarine sank with 118 crew members trapped inside, demonstrated that these risks persisted into the modern era and prompted renewed international cooperation on submarine rescue capabilities. Popular culture's fascination with U-boats grew substantially from the 1970s onward. Das Boot, both the 1973 novel by Lothar Gunther Buchheim and the 1981 film directed by Wolfgang Petersen, brought submarine warfare to mainstream audiences with unprecedented realism. Buchheim, a war correspondent who had served aboard U-boats during the war, drew on his personal experiences to create a gripping narrative that portrayed the claustrophobia, danger, and gradually mounting dread of prolonged submarine patrols. The film's success sparked renewed interest in U-boat history, leading to increased museum visits, new historical research, and the publication of numerous memoirs and academic studies. However, this cultural fascination sometimes walked a fine line between historical interest and inappropriate glorification. The U-boats had, after all, been instruments of a regime responsible for unspeakable atrocities. Presenting them as subjects of historical interest without appearing to celebrate Nazi Germany required careful balance. Museums displaying U-boats typically emphasize the human cost on all sides, the technological aspects, and the strategic context, while avoiding any romanticization of the Nazi cause. Educational materials. Accompanying submarine exhibits usually included significant information about the Holocaust and Nazi war crimes, ensuring that submarine technology was understood within its larger historical context. The archaeological work on the Deadlight wrecks, pioneered by Innes McCartney, opened unexpected windows into the operation's history. The condition of the wrecks revealed much about how they had been destroyed. Some showed massive holes in their pressure hulls, consistent with naval gunfire or aerial rocket attacks. Others appeared remarkably intact, suggesting they had been scuttled by opening sea valves rather than being violently destroyed. A few wrecks showed damage patterns consistent with breaking apart during sinking, their hull sections separated and lying near each other on the seabed. McCartney's most surprising discovery concerned the sheer number of submarines that sank during towing, rather than in the designated scuttling zones. His team found wrecks scattered across a wide area of the North Atlantic, well outside the official Deadlight zones. These represented the boats that had broken free from their tows, foundered in bad weather, or simply been too damaged to reach the scuttling grounds. The Royal Navy's records had documented these losses with coordinates, but the precision of 1940s navigation meant these positions were sometimes off by several miles. Finding the actual wrecks required systematic sonar surveys of large search areas. One wreck discovered during these surveys proved particularly intriguing. A submarine lying in deeper water than most Deadlight wrecks showed characteristics matching either U-55 or U-22, both of which were lost during towing operations. However, the wreck's exact identity remained uncertain due to damage and the limitations of sonar imaging. McCartney noted that resolving such identification questions would require remotely operated vehicle surveys or even manned submersible dives, expensive undertakings for purely historical purposes. As a result, some Deadlight wrecks remain positively identified, while others are known only as possible matches to specific boats. The wrecks also provided unexpected insights into the submarine's final cruise. British sailors who had been tasked with manning the U-boats during their towing sometimes left personal items aboard, either deliberately or accidentally. Sonar imaging revealed bottles and other objects on some wrecks that were clearly post-war in origin, physical evidence of the British sailors who had sailed these vessels on their final voyages. These artifacts created poignant connections across time, reminding researchers that the U-boat stories didn't end with German surrender but continued through their destruction phase. Environmental assessment of the Deadlight wrecks revealed that after more than 70 years underwater, they were gradually deteriorating. Corrosion was eating away at the steel hulls, and in some cases fuel oil was slowly leaking from the wrecks. However, the environmental impact remained minimal, as the oil dispersed naturally in the strong North Atlantic currents. The wrecks themselves had become artificial reefs, colonized by marine life and integrated into the local ecosystem. Fish sheltered in the conning towers and hull openings, while crustaceans and other invertebrates covered the steel surfaces. From instruments of death, the U-boats had been transformed into havens for sea life. The story of U-110 illustrated how submarine wrecks could continue revealing secrets decades after their loss. This Type 9B boat was captured by the Royal Navy on the 9th of May 1941, in one of the war's most significant intelligence coups. Forced to surface by depth charges, U-110 was boarded before the crew could destroy sensitive materials. The British recovered an Enigma machine and current codebooks, dramatically advancing Allied code-breaking efforts. However, the submarine sank while being towed to port, settling in deep water where it remained until being located in 1990s. When marine archaeologists examined U-110's wreck site, they found evidence suggesting that the British had deliberately scuttled it after recovering the Enigma material. Rather than risking the submarine reaching port where German intelligence might learn of its capture, British forces apparently opened its seacocks and let it sink. This maintained the crucial secret that Enigma had been compromised. The wreck's condition, with specific valves found in open positions, supported this theory, though definitive proof remained elusive. The possibility that U-110 was deliberately sunk to preserve intelligence secrets added another layer to its already significant historical importance. U-552, commanded by the famous Erich Topp during its most successful patrols, survived the war and surrendered in May 1945. This Type 7C submarine had sunk numerous Allied ships during the war's early years, including the destroyer USS Reuben James in October 1941, making it the first American warship sunk by German forces in World War II. After capture, U-552 was allocated to the Soviets under the Tripartite Agreement. Soviet engineers studied it intensively before using it as a target for weapons testing. The boat was deliberately destroyed in Soviet waters in the late 1940s, its exact fate poorly documented in available records. Topp, the submarine's most famous commander, survived the war, later joined the Bundesmarine and eventually reached the rank of Konteradmiral before retiring. He maintained that while he regretted the loss of life his attacks caused, he had been a naval officer executing lawful military orders in wartime. The gradual opening of Soviet archives after the Cold War's end revealed previously unknown details about Soviet acquisition and use of captured German submarines. The Soviet Union had been more systematic than previously understood in cataloguing German submarine technology. Teams of engineers created exhaustive documentation of every captured boat, producing thousands of pages of technical drawings, specifications, and test reports. These documents guided Soviet submarine development for decades, though Soviet designers took care to adapt German designs to Soviet manufacturing capabilities and operational doctrines, rather than simply copying them wholesale. Particularly valuable to the Soviets were the German developments in sound quieting. Submarines are most vulnerable when they can be heard by enemy sonar, so reducing noise emissions has always been a priority in submarine design. German engineers had made significant advances in this area, mounting machinery on rubber isolation mounts, using special propeller designs that minimize cavitation noise, and carefully designing piping systems to reduce flow noise. Soviet submarines incorporating these features proved significantly harder to detect than earlier models, giving the Soviet Navy a qualitative advantage that helped offset Western numerical and technological superiority in some areas. The Germans had also pioneered the use of rubber coatings on submarine hulls to reduce sonar reflections, essentially creating an early form of stealth technology. While this Albrecht coating proved difficult to maintain and was never fully perfected during the war, the concept influenced post-war sonar absorption research. Modern submarine hulls often incorporate anechoic tiles serving similar purposes, their design lineage traceable back to wartime German experiments. The continuity of naval technology development, spanning from World War II through the Cold War and into the present day, remains striking to those who study these connections. The human stories preserved in the Operation Deadlight wrecks extended beyond the submarines themselves. When the Royal Navy organised the Scuttling operation, they employed hundreds of British sailors to crew the tugs, escort vessels, and guard ships involved. For many of these men, Operation Deadlight represented their final wartime duty, the unglamorous task of disposing of enemy equipment rather than fighting battles. Their letters and diaries, preserved in archives and family collections, describe the tedious, difficult work of towing unstable submarines through winter storms, the relief when each group was safely scuttled, and the satisfaction of finally being demobilized and returning to civilian life. Some British sailors who participated in Operation Deadlight later developed unexpected connections to the U-boats they had helped destroy. One Royal Navy lieutenant, tasked with overseeing the scuttling of several submarines, became fascinated by submarine history and spent his retirement years researching U-boat operations during the war. His papers, donated to the Imperial War Museum, contain detailed notes on the boats he had personally sent to the bottom, including observations about their condition and the circumstances of their final voyages. He wrote that while the submarines had been enemy vessels, he felt they deserved to be remembered as memorials to all who had served in them, German and Allied alike. The discovery of U-boats in unexpected locations occasionally surprised maritime archaeologists. A submarine wreck found off the coast of Scotland in 2009 was initially believed to be a Deadlight casualty, but was eventually identified as U-772, a Type 7C boat sunk by Allied forces in December 1944 during combat operations. The wreck's location suggested it had been trying to reach a Norwegian port when attacked, providing new insights into U-boat movements during the war's final year. Such discoveries demonstrated that much remained to be learned about both wartime operations and post-war disposals, despite decades of historical research. The preservation challenges facing surviving U-boats have grown more pressing with time. Steel structures exposed to salt, air and water corrode relentlessly, and the submarines that survived World War II are now approaching 80 years old. Museums displaying these vessels face constant maintenance demands. U-995 at Le Beau requires regular hull inspections, rust treatment and repainting. Interior components need preservation efforts to prevent deterioration. The cost of maintaining these aging vessels strains museum budgets, yet the historical value of preserving actual submarines remains indisputable. U-505 in Chicago underwent a major restoration project in the early 2000s, ultimately costing millions of dollars. The submarine was moved indoors into a climate-controlled environment within the Museum of Science and Industry, protecting it from Chicago's harsh weather cycles. The hull was cleaned, treated for corrosion and repainted. Interior systems were stabilized, and new lighting and climate control systems were installed. The project ensured U-505's preservation for future generations, but highlighted the substantial resources required to maintain these historical artifacts. Similar challenges face every preserved U-boat worldwide. The question of what to do with newly discovered wrecks continues to generate debate. When U-581 was located off the coast of Morocco in 2012, lying in relatively shallow water accessible to recreational divers, concerns immediately arose about looting and damage. The wreck, sunk in combat in February 1942, is a war grave containing the remains of crew members who died when it was destroyed. International maritime law generally protects such sites, but enforcement proves difficult in international waters. Various parties argued for leaving the wreck undisturbed, recovering it for preservation, or at minimum conducting archaeological surveys to document its condition before natural deterioration or human interference destroyed it. Similar debates surrounded the discovery of other U-boat wrecks in subsequent years. Each case involved balancing historical interest, respect for the dead, environmental concerns, and practical limitations on resources and enforcement. The international community has generally moved toward policies favouring in-situ preservation, leaving wrecks where they lie but protecting them from unauthorised disturbance. However, implementing these policies across different national jurisdictions and in international waters remains challenging. The technological legacy of U-boats extends beyond submarines themselves into broader military and civilian applications. The control systems developed for submarine operations influenced the design of complex machinery, requiring precise human-machine interfaces. The life support systems that maintained breathable air in sealed environments informed space program development. The navigation systems that allowed submarines to determine their position while submerged contributed to inertial guidance technology used in missiles and spacecraft. The ripples of innovation spread far beyond their origin in undersea warfare. The psychological research conducted to select and train submarine crews also had lasting impact. The Germans had recognized that submarine service imposed unique mental stresses and developed selection processes to identify individuals capable of handling confined spaces, limited social interaction, and constant danger. These insights influenced personnel selection for other high-stress, isolated environments, including spaceflight, Antarctic research stations, and deep-sea exploration. The understanding that some individuals thrive in environments that would overwhelm others became a cornerstone of human factors research across multiple fields. The acoustic signature analysis that Allied forces developed to detect U-boats evolved into sophisticated sonar systems with applications far beyond military use. Modern oceanographic research, underwater archaeology, and marine biology all employ sonar technologies descended from wartime anti-submarine systems. The global mapping of the ocean floor has relied extensively on sonar techniques first refined to hunt German submarines. In this way, technology born from conflict has contributed to peaceful scientific exploration. The final years of U-boat veterans' lives, as they passed away in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, mark the end of living memory of submarine warfare's most intense period. The last survivor of U-96, the submarine featured in Das Boot, died in 2015. Other notable U-boat aces and crew members passed away throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Their deaths closed a chapter of history, leaving only physical artifacts, documents, and recorded testimonies to convey their experiences to future generations. The preserved submarines took on increased importance as the last tangible connections to events that shaped the modern world. Younger generations visiting U-boat museums often struggle to comprehend the conditions these men endured. Modern society, accustomed to personal space, privacy, and comfort, finds the cramped, airless environment of a submarine almost incomprehensible. The sleeping arrangements, with crew members hot bunking by sharing berths in shifts, seem degrading by contemporary standards. The limited washing facilities, the confined spaces, the knowledge that the entire crew would die together if the hull was breached, these realities of submarine life are difficult for comfortable modern visitors to fully appreciate. Yet hundreds of thousands of men on both sides chose or were assigned to submarine service and found ways to function in these conditions. The ceremonies commemorating submarine losses grew more frequent as veterans aged and organized efforts to honor their fallen comrades while they still could. Annual gatherings at submarine memorials brought together survivors who shared bonds forged in the Atlantic's depths. These events served multiple purposes: honoring the dead, maintaining connections among survivors, and educating younger generations about submarine warfare's realities. Attendance gradually dwindled as participants aged and died, but the tradition of commemoration continued, passed to families and historians who recognized its importance. The role of chance in determining which U-boats survived and which were destroyed in Operation Deadlight or allocated to Allied powers often came down to timing, location, and bureaucratic decisions. Two identical boats might have completely different fates based on where they happened to be when Germany surrendered, or which power zone they were located in. U-995, now preserved at La Boe, might easily have been scuttled if it had been in a different harbour. U-2540, which became Wilhelm and served for decades, could have been destroyed had it not been in a location where salvage proved feasible. These accidents of history determine which examples survived for future generations to study. The public's persistent fascination with U-boats has supported numerous documentary productions, historical publications, and museum exhibitions over the decades. Each generation rediscovers the submarine war through its own cultural lens. For those who lived through World War II, U-boats represented a deadly threat to survival. For the post-war generation, they became subjects of historical study and technological interest. For contemporary audiences, they are remote historical artifacts, their menace defanged by time and their technology superseded multiple times over. Yet the fundamental human drama they represent, courage, sacrifice, technological conflict, and moral complexity, retains its power to engage and educate. The question of whether preserving U-boats glorifies Nazi Germany or serves legitimate educational purposes has never been fully resolved, and different societies have reached different conclusions. German museums displaying U-boats emphasize education about the war's costs and the dangers of militarism. British and American displays focus more on technical aspects and the Allied victory. The tension between honoring those who served and condemning the regime they served remains present in all such exhibitions, managed through careful curation and contextualization, but never entirely eliminated. The lasting influence of German submarine design can be seen in unexpected places throughout modern naval architecture. The streamlined hull forms pioneered by the Type 21 influenced not just submarines but also surface ship design. Naval architects recognized that reducing hydrodynamic drag improved efficiency and speed, principles applicable to any vessel. Modern warship hulls often incorporate features first developed for submarines, demonstrating how innovations in one domain cross-pollinate into others. The science of fluid dynamics advanced substantially through submarine research, with applications extending from ship design to aircraft, automobiles, and even sports equipment. The Cold War submarine arms race, while terrifying in its implications, drove technological advancement at an unprecedented pace. Nuclear propulsion eliminated the need for submarines to surface or snorkel, creating true underwater vessels capable of remaining submerged for months. However, the basic design principles established by the Type 21 remained relevant. Streamlined hulls, quiet machinery, efficient battery backup systems for emergencies, these features descended directly from German wartime innovations. The USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear submarine launched in 1954, incorporated numerous design elements traceable to captured U-boats, though adapted for nuclear rather than diesel-electric propulsion. Soviet submarine development followed a similar pattern, but remained more closely tied to German designs for longer. The Whiskey-class boats, essentially improved Type 21, served as the Soviet Navy's primary conventional submarines through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Later Soviet classes incorporated progressive refinements, but the German influence remained visible in their basic architecture. This technological lineage created an ironic situation. Former allies were now adversaries, and both sides were using knowledge derived from their defeated common enemy to threaten each other. The U-boats had fought the Allies during World War II. Their descendants on both sides faced each other during the Cold War. The intelligence gathered from captured U-boats extended beyond pure technology into operational doctrine and tactics. German submarine commanders had developed sophisticated approaches to convoy attacks, evasion techniques, and crew management under combat stress. Allied navies studied these methods carefully, incorporating successful German practices while developing counters to German tactics. The result was a global elevation in submarine operational effectiveness as navies worldwide learned from Germany's extensive combat experience. Modern submarine warfare doctrine, taught at naval academies from Annapolis to St. Petersburg, still includes case studies from U-boat operations. The Battle of the Atlantic itself remains intensively studied as a campaign that nearly changed history. At certain points in the war, particularly during 1942 and early 1943, U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Had this continued, Britain might have been starved into submission, and the Allied build-up for the eventual invasion of Europe would have been impossible. The eventual Allied victory in the Atlantic campaign resulted from a combination of factors: improved convoy tactics, long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers, radar, code breaking, and sheer numerical superiority in shipbuilding. Each element proved necessary. None alone would have sufficed. The human cost of the Atlantic campaign remains staggering even when viewed decades later. Over 30,000 German submariners died during the war, representing approximately 75% of all men who served in U-boats. Allied merchant navies lost an estimated 30,000 personnel, with thousands more Allied naval personnel killed in escort and patrol duties. These figures represent individual tragedies multiplied tens of thousands of times. Families destroyed, potential unfulfilled, lives cut short. The steel wrecks on the ocean floor mark not just the locations where ships sank, but where human lives ended, often with little warning and no chance of survival. The archaeological work on submarine wrecks has helped personalize these statistics. When researchers identify specific U-boats and match them to crew records, abstract casualty figures transform into lists of names, ages, and hometowns. A wreck becomes not just a corroded steel hull, but the final resting place of particular individuals whose families may still exist. This personalization has led to debates about appropriate memorialization and whether families should be notified when their ancestors' final resting places are discovered. There are no clear answers, only attempts to balance historical research with respect for the dead and consideration for descendants. The environmental assessment of submarine wrecks has revealed another dimension of their legacy. Submarines carried fuel, lubricants, batteries containing toxic materials, and sometimes explosive ordnance. As hulls corrode over decades, these substances can leak into the surrounding waters. Most submarine wrecks pose minimal environmental risk due to their depth and the dispersal characteristics of the materials involved, but some require monitoring. The previously mentioned case of U-864 with its mercury cargo represents an extreme example, but even ordinary diesel fuel can cause localized environmental damage if released in concentrated quantities in sensitive areas. The preservation of submarines as museum ships has created permanent educational resources of immeasurable value. U-505 in Chicago has been visited by millions of people since it opened to the public, making it perhaps the most influential individual submarine in terms of public education about submarine warfare. Teachers regularly bring school groups to visit it, and the museum has developed extensive educational programs using the submarine as a teaching tool. The boat connects abstract historical concepts to physical reality in ways that books and films cannot match. Students who walk through U-505's torpedo room, see the cramped crew quarters, and stand in the control room gain visceral understanding of submarine operations. U-995 at Le Beau serves similar educational functions in Europe. Located near Germany's former U-boat construction centres, it attracts visitors from across the continent and beyond. German school groups visit to learn about their country's naval history, while visitors from other nations come to see an example of the submarines that once threatened Allied shipping. The Marine Ehrenmal Memorial adjacent to the submarine provides context about the human cost of naval warfare, ensuring that visitors understand the submarine not just as a technical artifact, but as part of a larger historical tragedy. Other preserved submarines around the world contribute to this educational mission. USS Bowfin, an American submarine preserved at Pearl Harbor, allows comparison between American and German submarine design and operations. HMS Alliance in Britain represents post-war submarine development, incorporating lessons learned from captured U-boats. Together, these preserved vessels create a global network of physical historical resources, each contributing unique perspectives on submarine warfare's development and impact. The tension between technical admiration and moral judgment persists in discussions of U-boat history. The submarines were undeniably impressive engineering achievements, representing sophisticated solutions to complex technical challenges. However, they served a regime guilty of unprecedented crimes against humanity. Can one appreciate the engineering while condemning the cause it served? Historians and ethicists have debated this question extensively, generally concluding that technological achievement and moral judgment operate on different axes. Recognizing engineering excellence does not require endorsing its application, just as condemning a regime does not require denying that it produced notable technical innovations. This distinction matters when educating younger generations about World War II history. Students need to understand that ordinary people, including talented engineers and courageous sailors, served Nazi Germany for various reasons: patriotism, duty, fear, opportunism, or genuine ideological conviction. Demonizing everyone who served the Third Reich oversimplifies a complex reality and makes it harder to understand how such regimes gain and maintain power. Conversely, focusing solely on technical achievements or military prowess while ignoring the larger moral context would be equally problematic. The challenge lies in presenting nuanced history that acknowledges multiple dimensions of truth simultaneously. The post-war careers of German submarine designers illustrated how technical expertise transcended political context. Several prominent German naval architects and submarine engineers found employment with Allied nations or neutral countries after the war. Their expertise was valuable regardless of which nation employed them, demonstrating that engineering knowledge operates independently of political systems. Some returned to Germany and contributed to the Bundesmarine's development in the 1950s and 1960s. Others worked in civilian shipbuilding, applying submarine design principles to merchant vessels. A few took positions in naval architecture education, training new generations of submarine designers. The ethical questions surrounding these post-war careers remain debatable. Should engineers who designed weapons for Nazi Germany have been allowed to profit from that expertise after the war? Did employing them imply acceptance or forgiveness of their previous service? Or was it simply pragmatic recognition that their knowledge had value regardless of its origin? Different societies reached different conclusions, but the general pattern involved utilizing German technical expertise while maintaining clear rejection of Nazi ideology. The scientists and engineers were judged on their technical contributions rather than their political past, a controversial decision that nonetheless facilitated rapid post-war technological development. The story of the Type XSB submarine, a design even more advanced than the Type 25 that never progressed beyond planning stages, illustrates how close Germany came to fielding truly revolutionary submarines. This proposed design would have used hydrogen peroxide as a fuel for air-independent propulsion, potentially allowing underwater speeds exceeding 25 knots and extended, submerged operations. Had the war continued another year or two, these boats might have entered service, potentially changing the strategic balance in the Atlantic. The Allies discovered plans for the Type Textsystem among captured documents and recognized how significant a threat it would have posed. Several nations experimented with hydrogen peroxide propulsion after the war, building on German research. Britain constructed HMS Explorer and HMS Excalibur, experimental submarines using similar systems. The technology proved problematic, with safety concerns and maintenance difficulties outweighing the performance advantages. Eventually, nuclear power provided a better solution for extended underwater endurance, and hydrogen peroxide propulsion was abandoned. However, modern air-independent propulsion systems using different chemical processes descended conceptually from the Type XEFC's design philosophy, showing that even ideas that failed initially could inspire successful later developments. The final surviving U-boat veterans reached advanced ages in the early 21st century, many living into their 90s. Their passing removed the last direct witnesses to submarine warfare's most intense period. Before they died, many gave interviews, wrote memoirs, or participated in documentaries, ensuring their experiences would be preserved for future generations. These testimonies provide invaluable perspectives on submarine operations, combat experiences, and the psychological challenges of underwater warfare. Historians studying these accounts found recurring themes: the claustrophobia, the constant danger, the mixture of boredom and terror, and the intense bonds formed among crew members facing death together. Several veterans expressed complicated feelings about their wartime service. Many took pride in their technical accomplishments and the courage required for submarine duty, while feeling regret about serving the Nazi regime. Others maintained that they had simply been sailors doing their duty, divorcing their military service from political ideology. A few remained unrepentant, viewing their wartime actions as justified responses to Allied aggression. These varying perspectives remind us that historical actors rarely fit simple narratives of heroes or villains, but instead occupy more complex moral spaces requiring nuanced understanding. The commemoration of submarine warfare has evolved to emphasize universal themes rather than celebrating particular sides. Modern naval ceremonies often honor all submariners lost at sea, regardless of nationality. This approach recognizes that the dangers of submarine service and the courage required to face them transcended political divisions. Submariners on all sides experienced similar hardships and faced similar risks. While this does not erase the very real moral differences between Allied and Axis causes, it acknowledges a shared human dimension to submarine warfare that allows for commemoration without celebration of any particular regime. The impact of submarine warfare extended beyond the immediate conflict into post-war international law and maritime policy. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, developed through decades of negotiation, includes provisions addressing submarine operations, territorial waters, and innocent passage that reflected lessons learned from World War II submarine campaigns. The Geneva Convention's provisions regarding merchant ships and civilian vessels partly responded to the controversies surrounding unrestricted submarine warfare. International maritime law evolved substantially in response to technologies and tactics first demonstrated during the Battle of the Atlantic. The strategic implications of submarine warfare influenced Cold War deterrence theory significantly. The development of ballistic missile submarines created a survivable, second strike capability that stabilized the nuclear balance between superpowers. Submarines carrying nuclear missiles could hide in the ocean depths, effectively immune to first strikes, ensuring that any nuclear attack would face devastating retaliation. This underwater nuclear deterrent descended directly from World War II submarine warfare concepts, though applied to a fundamentally different strategic purpose. The U-boats had sought to strangle enemy supply lines. Their Cold War descendants guaranteed mutual annihilation, paradoxically maintaining peace through the threat of unprecedented destruction. The acoustic cat-and-mouse game between submarines and anti-submarine forces that began during World War II continues into the present day. Modern navies invest billions in making submarines quieter and in developing better ways to detect quiet submarines. This technological competition drives innovation in materials, science, signal processing, computer technology, and numerous other fields. The basic challenge remains unchanged from the U-boat era. Submarines try to become undetectable, while their opponents try to find them anyway. The tools have advanced enormously, but the fundamental contest persists. The cultural legacy of U-boats extends into popular entertainment, where submarines feature prominently in films, novels, and video games. While Das Boot remains the most influential submarine film, numerous other productions have explored submarine warfare from various angles. The Hunt for Red October brought Cold War submarine operations to mainstream audiences. U-571, though historically inaccurate, demonstrated continued public fascination with U-boat stories. These cultural products both reflect and shape public understanding of submarine warfare, sometimes accurately, sometimes less so. Historians often find themselves correcting misconceptions propagated by entertainment media, though they also appreciate that such media keeps public interest in naval history alive. Video games featuring submarine combat have introduced younger generations to the subject, though with varying degrees of historical accuracy. Silent Hunter and other submarine simulation games allow players to experience something approximating submarine operations, creating engagement with naval history in interactive formats. While simplified compared to actual submarine operations, these games foster interest that can lead to deeper historical study. Museums displaying submarines report that video gamers often visit to see real examples of vessels they have commanded virtually, demonstrating how different educational approaches can complement each other. The ongoing maintenance of preserved submarines requires continuous fundraising and technical expertise. Museums face the challenge of maintaining 80-year-old vessels with degrading materials, obsolete systems, and components that cannot be replaced because the original manufacturers no longer exist. Preservation specialists must balance authenticity with practicality, sometimes using modern materials to replace deteriorated original components while maintaining visual accuracy. The work never ends. Corrosion continues, structural integrity requires constant monitoring, and deterioration advances despite best efforts. These preservation challenges mean that some submarines will eventually become too deteriorated to save, making current preservation efforts all the more important. The scattered underwater graveyards where U-boats rest, from the Operation Deadlight sites to combat losses across the Atlantic and other seas, create a distributed memorial to the submarine war. Unlike concentration of war graves at places like Normandy or Gettysburg, the submarine war's casualties lie dispersed across vast ocean areas, often in deep water inaccessible to most people. This dispersal mirrors the nature of submarine warfare itself, spread across enormous distances, operating in isolation, facing death far from witnesses or support. The wrecks on the ocean floor stand as silent witnesses to events that shaped the modern world, their stories gradually being uncovered through archival research and underwater archaeology. The lessons learned from the U-boat experience continue to inform naval doctrine and strategic thinking. The importance of protecting sea lines of communication, the value of technological superiority, the need for coordination between different military services, and the role of intelligence in warfare all were demonstrated clearly during the Battle of the Atlantic. Modern military academies study these campaigns as instructive examples of how maritime warfare influences broader strategic outcomes. The U-boats ultimately failed to achieve their objective of starving Britain into submission, but they came close enough that the campaign remains studied as an example of how sea power can influence continental warfare. Today, the preserved boats and the wrecks below the Atlantic serve as twin memorials, one above water, one below, telling the final story of Germany's submarine fleet, an empire of steel that now rests in silence between history and the sea. These submarines, whether displayed in museums or lying on the ocean floor, connect present generations to a pivotal period when submarine warfare nearly changed history. They remind us of the technological innovation driven by conflict, the human costs of war, and the importance of understanding history in all its complexity. The U-boats that once struck fear into Allied merchant sailors now serve as teachers, their preserved hulls offering lessons about engineering, warfare, courage, tragedy, and the consequences of technological advancement divorced from moral consideration. Future generations will continue to study them, finding new insights and asking new questions. The submarines themselves will gradually deteriorate, but the knowledge they represent and the stories they tell will remain as long as humans study history and seek to understand our past. The final chapter of the U-boat story is still being written. Archaeological discoveries continue to locate previously unknown wrecks. Archives occasionally yield new documents revealing previously unknown operations. Veterans' families sometimes contribute previously private letters and photographs to historical collections. Each addition to the historical record enriches our understanding of submarine warfare and its participants. The story that began with Admiral Dönitz's surrender order on the 8th of May 1945 continues to unfold as historians, archaeologists, and descendants piece together the complete picture of what happened to Germany's U-boats after World War II. What we know now is that the fate of the U-boats reflected the broader fate of Nazi Germany: defeat, dispersal, and absorption into the post-war world. Some were destroyed, their steel returned to the ocean floor they had once prowled. Others were captured and studied, their technology harvested to serve former enemies. A few survived as museums and memorials, physical links to a vanished era. Together, they represent the end of one chapter in naval warfare and the beginning of another. The transition from diesel-electric to nuclear submarines, from World War II to the Cold War, from enemies to the complex post-war realignment that shaped the modern world. The submarines themselves were machines, neither good nor evil, but the uses to which they were put and the causes they served carried profound moral weight. Understanding this distinction, appreciating the technology, while acknowledging the darkness of the regime it served, remains essential to properly understanding this history. The preserved U-boats offer opportunities for such understanding, physical artifacts that can inspire both technical admiration and moral reflection. The international submarine community that emerged after World War II included many former adversaries working together. Submarine officers from different nations met at conferences, shared technical knowledge, and developed professional relationships that transcended wartime enmities. This cooperation reflected broader post-war reconciliation efforts but had practical dimensions as well. Submarines operated in similar environments, facing similar challenges regardless of which flag they flew. Knowledge sharing benefited all parties, even as the Cold War created new divisions and competitive pressures. The establishment of NATO's submarine forces required integrating different national submarine doctrines and technologies into a coherent alliance structure. Former enemies needed to coordinate operations and share information. German submarine expertise, while initially controversial, eventually contributed to this integration as West Germany rebuilt its navy and joined NATO in 1955. Former U-boat officers and crew members found themselves serving alongside British and American submariners who had fought against them a decade earlier. These personal interactions, sometimes awkward, sometimes surprisingly warm, reflected the larger process of European integration and Cold War alliance formation. The Soviet Union's isolation from this Western submarine community created a parallel development track. Soviet submarines evolved independently, drawing on captured German technology, but developing unique operational doctrines and tactical approaches. This divergence meant that when Western and Soviet submarines encountered each other during the Cold War, they brought different philosophies and capabilities to their interactions. The underwater cat-and-mouse games between NATO and Soviet submarines throughout the Cold War represented the continuation of submarine warfare in a new context, though thankfully one that never escalated to actual combat. The role of submarines in nuclear deterrence fundamentally changed their strategic significance. During World War II, submarines had been commerce raiders and scouts, significant but ultimately auxiliary to surface fleets and land-based air power. With the advent of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, submarines became central to strategic deterrence. This elevation in importance meant that submarine technology received enormous investment and attention. The design principles established by the Type WW2 and other late-war German submarines influenced this new generation of strategic weapons platforms, though adapted for nuclear propulsion and missile armament, rather than torpedo attacks on merchant ships. The environmental consciousness that emerged in the late 20th century created new perspectives on submarine wrecks and their preservation. What had been simply historical artifacts or navigational hazards came to be understood as potential pollution sources requiring environmental assessment and sometimes remediation. The balance between preserving wrecks as historical sites and war graves versus managing environmental risks required new approaches to underwater cultural heritage. International organizations developed guidelines for assessing and managing these competing concerns, creating frameworks that hadn't existed when most U-boats were scuttled. The digitization of historical records in recent decades has enabled new research into U-boat history. War diaries, technical documents, and personnel records that once required visits to archives are now often available online. This democratization of access has allowed more people to research U-boat operations, identify individual submarines, and trace the fates of specific boats and crew members. Amateur historians and descendants of U-boat personnel have made significant contributions to historical knowledge through this increased access, supplementing professional historical research with grassroots investigations. The social media age has created online communities focused on U-boat history, connecting enthusiasts, descendants, and researchers worldwide. These digital spaces allow sharing of photographs, documents, and stories that might otherwise remain isolated in family collections. They also facilitate international connections that would have been impossible in earlier eras. A British person whose grandfather served on merchant ships can connect with Germans whose grandfathers served on U-boats, sometimes discovering that their ancestors' ships encountered each other during the war. These personal connections across generational and national lines create new dimensions of understanding and reconciliation. The ongoing discovery of previously unknown documents continues to refine historical understanding of U-boat operations and post-war disposal. Recently declassified intelligence documents have revealed details about the Allied code-breaking efforts against German naval communications, showing how thoroughly Allied forces could track U-boat movements. By late in the war, these revelations have prompted reassessment of various naval engagements and campaign decisions, demonstrating that historical understanding continues evolving as new information becomes available. The question of what should be done with U-boat artifacts recovered from wrecks remains contentious. Some argue that any recovery amounts to grave robbing and disturbing of war graves. Others contend that careful archaeological recovery of artifacts for preservation and study honors the dead by ensuring their stories are remembered and understood. The international community has generally moved toward policies restricting unauthorized recovery while allowing controlled archaeological excavation under appropriate circumstances. However, enforcement remains challenging, and illegal salvage of submarine wrecks continues despite protective regulations. The stories of individual crew members, once they can be traced through archival research and connected to specific boats and operations, personalize the broader historical narrative. One such story involves Werner Hartenstein, commander of U-156, who torpedoed the British troopship Laconia on the 12th of September 1942. Upon discovering that Laconia carried Italian prisoners of war, theoretically German allies, Hartenstein attempted a rescue operation, summoning other U-boats and even requesting assistance from Vichy French vessels. During the rescue, American aircraft attacked the clearly marked submarines despite them displaying Red Cross flags. Hartenstein survived this incident, but was killed when U-156 was sunk by American aircraft in March 1943. His attempt to balance military duty with humanitarian concern in an impossible situation illustrates the moral complexities individuals faced during the war. The evolution of submarine rescue and escape technology in the post-war era drew heavily on lessons learned from U-boat losses. The realization that many submarines sank with survivors trapped inside prompted development of better rescue capabilities. Deep submergence rescue vehicles, improved escape suits, and international submarine rescue cooperation agreements all emerged from recognition that submarine disasters could strike any navy and that humanitarian concerns transcended national rivalries. The NATO submarine rescue system, developed in recent decades, represents multilateral cooperation that would have been unthinkable during World War II. The contrast between the careful preservation of a few U-boats and the deliberate destruction of hundreds through Operation Deadlight reflects differing values and priorities across time. In 1945, the priority was eliminating weapons quickly and economically, with little thought for historical preservation. By the 1960s, when some scuttled submarines were raised and preserved, attitudes had shifted toward recognizing historical artifacts' educational value. Today, with the last World War II veterans passing away, the physical artifacts become even more important as direct connections to the era disappear. This evolution in preservation attitudes reflects broader changes in how societies relate to their pasts. The technical documentation captured from U-boats proved as valuable as the boats themselves in some ways. Detailed engineering drawings, construction specifications, and operational manuals revealed not just how submarines functioned, but the entire design philosophy behind them. Allied engineers could see the decisions German designers had made when balancing competing requirements: speed versus range, armor versus agility, firepower versus survivability. Understanding these trade-offs informed post-war submarine design across all navies, as designers everywhere faced similar constraints and challenges. The story of the crews who sailed U-boats to their final destruction in Operation Deadlight deserves recognition alongside the submarine's own stories. These British and American sailors performed unglamorous, difficult, and sometimes dangerous duty, managing barely seaworthy vessels through winter storms to ensure their proper disposal. They represented the vast number of military personnel whose service involves routine but essential tasks rather than combat glory. Their contribution to ending the submarine threat, though mundane compared to wartime heroics, was nonetheless real and significant. The question of whether submarines fundamentally changed naval warfare or simply represented incremental evolution remains debated among naval historians. Submarines existed before World War II, but the scale and intensity of their employment during the Battle of the Atlantic was unprecedented. The post-war elevation of submarines to strategic importance through nuclear propulsion and ballistic missiles suggests revolutionary impact. However, the basic principles of submarine operations, stealth, surprise and vulnerability when detected, remained constant across technological generations. Perhaps submarines represented both evolutionary and revolutionary change depending on which aspects one examines. The Cold War's end brought changes to how submarine history was remembered and taught. With the Soviet Union's collapse, many previously classified details about submarine operations on both sides became available. Russian archives opened, revealing information about Soviet submarine development and operations. Western nations declassified their own records, showing the extent of intelligence operations against Soviet submarines. This opening of archives enriched historical understanding, but also complicated narratives that had seemed clear during the Cold War. The reality proved more nuanced than propaganda from either side had suggested. Modern submarine forces operate in contexts vastly different from World War II, yet they still study historical submarine campaigns for lessons. The U-boat campaign teaches about the importance of protecting maritime supply lines, the value of intelligence, and the need for integrated approaches combining multiple warfare domains. These lessons remain relevant even as technologies advance. The fundamental challenge of finding and neutralizing submarines continues to occupy naval planners worldwide, making the World War II submarine campaign perpetually relevant to contemporary strategy. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video, What Happened to Germany's Weapons and Tanks After World War II. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more WW2 content. See you in the next one.